started the job by having a look at the vents, quite a large one there, a large one here as well, although there are some smaller ones around the place, a total of 5 vents to be backfilled. Once we removed the vents, we were able to look inside and see what area we had to work with in terms of how we would reinforce the new plaster piece being placed. I was happy to see that there was lots of room for us to work with inside. The next task was to measure the furring strip that would go into the hole. For this, we measured the total width and added an extra 100 millimeters, which would allow 50 millimeters each side as support inside the hole. We placed our newly cut furling strips into the hole and screwed the plaster to the furling strips. Our goal was to create a nice, flat, strong surface for which to bond the new plaster to. We did this for every hole. Our next stage was to measure the length and width of each of the holes. These measurements would later be used to cut the plaster pieces that would eventually be fitted inside to cover the holes. I wasn't too concerned about being precise in the measurements because I knew the outside edges would be later taped up and filled with plaster. We then took our measurements to mark up and cut the plaster pieces we needed for each of the holes. To cut plaster, it's simply a matter of marking up your dimensions, drawing a straight line, and then running a sharp tool along that line to ensure that you score the plaster. Afterwards, the plaster can be snapped along the score line and cleaned up with the knife where necessary. If you are purchasing plaster for ceiling, make sure it is specific ceiling plaster. Ceiling plaster is very different from wall plaster in that it undergoes a specific manufacturing process to strengthen it from sagging. The other thing to consider is that plaster is available at various thicknesses, so make sure you purchase a thickness that is compatible with your existing ceiling. Having cut all the pieces, we test fitted them all to ensure they were correctly sized before moving on to the next stage of our project. We were now ready to insert the newly cut plaster pieces into the holes, but before doing so, we added some stud adhesive to help strengthen the hold. Now it was simply a process of raising the plaster and placing it gently into the hole and fixing with the appropriate plaster screw. First we did one side, then we moved over the other side and added sufficient number of screws to ensure that the edges were as flush as we could get them and that the plaster piece was as secure as possible. I'm now ready to tape over all of my joints, and for this I'd recommend fibre fusion tape. I find it's extremely strong and it sets very flat against the ceiling. I also like to cut all of my lengths in advance because I'm using a hot set mud or hot set plaster, and I don't want to be competing with trying to cut lengths while the plaster is setting, so I like to have all of my preparation work done prior to mixing the plaster. Here I am mixing up the plaster. Just follow the instructions on the bag. It's very easy to mix up. Don't buy the stuff in the tubs. Buy this stuff, it's much more economical. You can get it to the consistency you need and mix up only as much as you can use within the period of time that it sets. This particular one sets in 45 minutes, so I'll make it up so it's a peanut butter consistency and apply it, and then later come back and make up some more for the remainder of the job. Here I am now applying the mud to the cracks and I'm filling those cracks, and I'm pressing in quite firm so that the product goes deep inside the cracks and helps fuse the two surfaces together. It also creates a nice flat surface for the tape that will go on next. And once I put that tape over the top of that surface, the tape is quite porous anyway. Some of the product will seep through the tape, but I will also run the knife across the fibre fused tape that I've used with some additional product to get it nice and flat. Now, if you're wondering why I'm using that particular knife, it's because that's all my friend had. And it's not my preferred tool, but hey, we made it work. Now I'm going to apply the tape, and you recall from earlier before that I did cut it at certain lengths, so I should be just about right. There might be a little bit of an error, but I want to lay it nice and clean across the joint, but also I don't really want to overlap the tape because that's just going to create an unnecessary raised surface. So I'm just lining them up so that they're not overlapping each other, and the final piece I'll probably have to cut or trim up just to make sure that that doesn't happen. So now I'm applying some more mud over the top of the tape to help embed that tape, and that will really ensure that it fuses well with the existing plaster, covering up those holes and helping me get a nice flat surface. So I'm very conscious at this point not to raise the plaster too high, and also not to press in too much now, because if I press in too much now, I'm going to actually compress the mud, and it's going to be very, very difficult to sand later. So I want it look nice and light, just covering over that edge of that tape and getting a flat surface. So I'm running the knife along the edge, but I'm keeping it quite light as I'm pushing it against the surface area. The plaster's dry, so now I'm sanding, and you can see that the plaster is falling away quite easily, and that's because I didn't press it down too hard. I'm also using a 120 grit sandpaper here, and I'm sanding the raised areas and feeling with my hand to identify other raised areas. I'm looking for overall smoothness, but it's a process of incrementally addressing any of the raised areas, but making sure that we're not sitting in one spot for too long with the sander, otherwise we'll end up with a lumpy surface. So this is the final coat of product going on. This stuff comes in a tub. It's designed for the last coat. Very, very fine, very easy to sand. I like to thin it out a little bit with a bit more water so that it's more pliable. It takes about 24 hours to dry, so you've got lots of working time with it, but I can see while I'm working with it that it's really smooth and very, very easy to apply. Once again, I'm not pressing it into the material because I don't want to compact the mud to a point where it becomes really difficult to sand later. And that's how it finished up after that final coat. So once it's dried, it'll be ready to lightly sand and paint. Thanks for watching.